Hi, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable at the Observer Research Foundation. Today, we will be discussing a fairly interesting topic, which is tracing China in the Middle East. As we all know, China is increasingly placing itself as not a power that is in waiting, but that a power that has already arrived. And with that discourse, we see China being discussed in every part of the geography of this planet today, whether it's in the Asia Pacific, whether it's in Africa, in the Middle East, Europe, and so on. There is no denying that China's economic influence is a big reality today and difficult to ignore. And like other regions across the world, Beijing's economic and strategic heft is visible in the Middle East as well. To discuss this further, we have an excellent panel of experts to guide us through some of these challenges and questions. I'll start with very brief introductions of them, and then very quickly they will give a small 5 to 8 minutes view of how they see this topic developing in the future. And after that, we will go into a much more freer moderated debate and a Q&A amongst ourselves. So to start with, we have Ambassador Navdeep Suri, who's a distinguished fellow with the Observer Research Foundation and a former Indian ambassador to UAE, Egypt, and former High Commissioner to Australia. We've got Dr. Jonathan Fulton, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Zayed University, UAE, and a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Atlantic Council. We've got Karis Witt, Founder and Executive Director, Sino Israel Global Network and Academic Leadership, or Signal, from Israel. And soon we will also be joined by Camille Loynes, Research Associate, International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a Taiwan Fellow with the National Taiwan University. So just to begin with, may I invite Ambassador Suri to speak a few words on the topic that we have today.
Thank you, Kabir. Pleasure to join you with this distinguished group. You'd suggested that maybe I can start by giving a bit of an India perspective. So let me begin by acknowledging that India was a bit sanguine about Chinese inroads into the Gulf in particular during the early times. And the reason was we seemed to be overly confident, perhaps overly dependent on our own deep historical ties, our people to people connections, the presence of the significant Indian diaspora in the Gulf. And there was always this feeling that while India's connect with the Gulf and with the Middle East more broadly was a very emotional one and a deep one. Yes, the Chinese were coming, but theirs was a more transactional relationship. And that warmth that we see the leadership in the Gulf exude towards India was perhaps not quite the same when it came to the Chinese. Then we saw the Dragon Mart come into Dubai. We saw China displace India as UAE's largest trading partner, as a case in point. And then we started to see more worryingly that the string of pearls strategy that China had been trying to execute in our part of the world, in our immediate neighborhood in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, unsuccessfully in Maldives, was being replicated in the Middle East as well through these large industrial estates and port ventures, which had a clear strategic footprint about them. And it tied in with what Chinese scholars themselves were saying about establishing strong points at key locations to safeguard their sea lanes of communication and protect their trade and commerce. In UAE, we saw the whole thing with the Khalifa port in Abu Dhabi, the great announcements about the big industrial zone, and then the Americans coming up and saying, hey, actually, there's also an undisclosed or undeclared um, military or secret component to the port. We saw a different dimension in the whole discussions around 5G and the footprint that Huawei was trying to establish, and ZTE, and of course the Americans and others frantically trying to dissuade the Chinese, the Emiratis, and the others from going down that road. Um, so, we've seen, I mean, for me, particularly revealing when I was ambassador in UAE was the way the Emiratis publicly acknowledged using the Winglong unmanned combat aircraft, um, armed drones in Yemen. And this was kind of their way of signaling to the Americans that if you are not willing to give us the Predators or the Reapers or others, then there are options available to us. And of course, on the 5G, we saw the whole um, controversy connecting F-35s with the demand from the Americans that the Emiratis should take a step back from that. Again, with the Saudis, we've seen the reports of Chinese coming in with the missile production facilities. The missiles had already been there for a long time. Um, we, again, they see Saudi Arabia as a very integral part of their Belt and Road Initiative, uh, and um, and Saudis have reciprocated well by being exceptionally supportive even on the Uyghur controversy in 2019. They even defended China at the UNHCR meeting and privately offered to deport some Uyghurs back to China. And my sense on this, more broadly speaking, is that some of this is tied to Chinese proactivism and the value proposition that they increasingly offer, not just in commercial terms, but also in security and strategic terms, and their willingness to provide technology and weapons on a no questions asked sort of a basis. But I think part of this is also linked to the ambiguity in the U.S. position towards the region. I mean, I know that the both the Saudis and the Emiratis were extremely upset in the way the Obama administration went about JCPOA without any consultation with their friends and allies in the Gulf. The Gulf states really felt that they'd been shortchanged in the process, and Americans hadn't paid enough attention to their concerns about Iranian missile programs, about Iranian interventions in the region, and you know, of course, there was the whole Khashoggi affair, etc. And again, with the Biden administration coming in, that had cast a shadow on the relationship. So I think where we are today is, until now, I think key countries in the region, Egypt, for its own reasons, UAE and Saudi Arabia have been hedging um, to see whether they can use China as leverage to get a more active US engagement, perhaps in the re-engagement in the region. And perhaps that's working because, despite all his initial pronunciations, President Biden seems to be coming back to the region in July. And it'll be interesting to see what that holds in store, whether it is the potential of Saudis pumping more oil, or Saudis moving a little bit faster than they have been in terms of rapprochement with Israel, or any of the other factors. There's some conversation about US security guarantees that may be forthcoming, which begs the question that, if these were your allies, then what happened to the security guarantees? And I know that both the Saudis and the Emiratis were pretty unhappy about the very lukewarm US reaction when their oil facilities and cities were being targeted by drones and missiles. So you can see that there was this, over the last few years. There's been this unhappiness building up. Trump, to the Saudis and to an extent to the Emiratis, was a breath of fresh air after Obama, because he seemed to be ready to ignore some of the less pleasing stuff and move forward. Um, Biden came with with the same Obama-like concerns, and the fact that there were many holdovers from the Obama administration in the new administration again gave rise to these concerns. And I think the Chinese have been quick to take advantage of that and expand their inroads into the region. So I'll just conclude with two or three short comments. I think one is, perhaps post July, we might see a recalibration happening with President Biden's visit. Um, the the indication of this new I2, U2, India, Israel, UAE, US virtual summit taking place during the visit is interesting. And what I would be keen to see is that just as the Quad and the Indo-Pacific uh, has developed very clear Chinese characteristics, are we going to see something similar emerge out of the I2U2 as we go forward? And I certainly see India and the US being two of the more willing partners in this, with question marks around UAE and Israel in terms of how far they would like to go down that road. There's a second aspect, which is when we talk about the Chinese industrial estate come port model for strategic expansion in the region. It's perhaps worthwhile to look at what happened in Djibouti, from where DP World was unceremoniously evicted by the Chinese. They had invested some $700 million in the port, and they've been crying horse. They've won the arbitration awards, but nothing very much seems to have happened in terms of their angst. And one final thought I'll share, and this is something that I picked up during my last visit to Abu Dhabi from friends of mine in the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which is the big sovereign wealth fund over there. And this is interesting because ADIA has been a major investor in China over the last few years. But what I was hearing was that that the concentration of power in Xi Jinping and the uncertainty created by some of his recent actions in terms of the tech sector and the crash in valuations that you saw has actually created a degree of nervousness. And so, to a certain extent, big entities like ADIA are now more worried about China than they were even 2 years back, and will probably look more actively at countries like India in terms of their engagement going forward. So let me just stop at that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That's, as always, a lot to unpack there, and we'll come to that in our discussions later. Can I invite Carice now for her statements? I think you're on mute, Carice.
Apologies. This is a new system for me. I want to thank ORF and Kabir for the invitation to join the panel. It's great that you're focusing on China and the Middle East, because it's definitely a growing area of focus for China, and a place where great power rivalry is going to continue playing out. So you proposed the question of how China manages all its relations in the Middle East, and Beijing has certainly done a very good job to this day of staying on good terms with everyone, Arab states as well as Iran, Turkey, and Israel. But one area where Israel's relations with China differ from the rest of the region is that both the US and the Muslim states have impacted Sino-Israeli relations from the early days, 1940s, late 1940s to the present. Although Israel was the first to recognize China in the Middle East, the new People's Republic, just a few years later, China joined the non-aligned states and took on the Arab boycott, which meant having nothing to do with Israel. And I think a brief history of our relations is necessary to understand where we are now. because also Israel's special relations with the US has remained a factor of influence both on Israel towards China and vice versa. That special relationship carries a lot of weight in Israel and was again mentioned in some depth during the June 14 White House press briefing on Biden's upcoming visit that the ambassador just alluded to, coming to Israel and Saudi Arabia July 13 to 16, which will be Biden's first visit as president to Israel. In China, Israel essentially remained persona non grata from about 1955 and through the 70s when it began purchasing defense equipment under the table. And even after 1992, when official relations were established, the connections remained shallow, despite the fact that those arms deals moved over the table with quiet US support, where it wanted Israel to help draw China away from the Soviet orbit. But for all that defense activity and some drip irrigation, there were almost no people-to-people exchanges, no academia, tourism, etc. In 2010, when China officially announced it would become global innovators, its attitude towards Israel began to change, and support of the Arab boycott was trumped by an interest in Israel's huge tech and innovation ecosystem. And over the next 8 years, relations between our countries broadened significantly. It should be mentioned that this innovation tech connection did not include in any way military or defense equipment or technology. That has been completely off the table since the Falcon and Harpy drone crises in 2000 and 2004. And I don't have time to expound, and it's not really the point here today, but suffice it to say, China-Israel relations had to take a new direction. In 2013, when our Prime Minister Netanyahu went to China, he and President Xi established an innovation partnership. And then Wang Yi came to Israel and said, if we can only take the Israeli chip and put it into the Chinese machine, we'll have a new engine for both economies. And over the next few years, there was significant investment from China into Israel's tech and innovation sectors. Daily flights were established between 3 or 4 major Chinese cities and Israel, and they were all waiting list only. Then in 2017, our Prime Minister Netanyahu went back to China, and the relationship was upgraded to a comprehensive innovation partnership. And we saw something in the realm of 150,000 tourists from China in Israel, which for our small country is quite a lot. But we need to remember that all of this is in the context of bifurcating politics and economics. So Beijing can take an anti-Israel stance amidst what's otherwise a very amicable and positive relationship. The thinking is that by criticizing Israel politically, China's winning support of the Muslim states, such as more votes in international fora. And China's maintained this very critical political stance on Israel while ramping up business investment, innovation, and tech relations, which Israel's very happy about. I mean, the latter part. Last May, however, China tried to take the US down a peg during the Gaza war last year, where 4,000 rockets were shot at civilians across Israel, with China saying that the US support for Israel went against morality. And this is in the context of the gathering of democracies and the position that they're taking on autocracies. Around the same time, Chinese embassies in France and Japan published anti-Semitic cartoons, like that's so official, out of the embassies. And that led to one of the Israeli government's very rare political pushbacks, where we signed on to the Canadian-initiated joint statement on the human rights situation in Xinjiang. That was last year. Just a few days ago, we did it again, signing on to the Dutch statement. At the same time, China has continued to win most of the infrastructure tenders within Israel. And the Haifa port that received so much press about US wanting China out, China's still running it, and by the way, with quite impressive advanced equipment. There is now, you could say post-COVID for most of the world, if not China, a renewed interest from China in Israeli tech, and the UIBE, the University of International Business and Economics of China, established only its second branch outside of China in Israel. Meanwhile, Israel's following the progress of the digital Silk Road's expansion across the region, and the ambassador mentioned Huawei. Huawei alone has about 120 active projects in 19 countries across the region. Israel has noted with great interest the many BRI infrastructure projects, including the swift uptake of projects in Iraq. And Israel greatly applauds China's efforts in Egypt, which are contributing to stability there. And in general, Israel would like to see China promote regional stability in the Middle East, which of course brings us to Iran. China's made it crystal clear to Israel that it does not want the country to obtain nuclear weapons. And policy experts have clarified that in their view, China does not see Iran as a real threat to Israel. Of course, that perspective is in diametric opposition to Israel's, but it does indicate their thinking and areas where Israel is working to move the needle. Regarding the Abraham Accords, there's been a real transformation in China's take. At first, we heard they saw it as targeting China and a US effort to remove China from the region. There was concern in Beijing that the accords could replace the JCPOA as a regional security framework. But by the end of last year, the Chinese government and policy officials were congratulating Israel on impressive developments. And China knows how to adapt, and now there seem to be there is more of an ear, I would say, to the changes taking place in the Middle East. And although China and Israel do not see eye to eye on a range of issues, there's a great deal of mutual respect and practical motivation to work together in a variety of areas, which creates a certain amount of pushback by Israel on some of the messaging from the US, although not all. There are areas where Israel is quite sensitive and careful to comply. Finally, I would say that Israel will be watching China in the Middle East much more closely on the land projects in the sea, in the region, in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean, and of course in the digital spheres. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. And I'll quickly move to Dr. Fulton. And hi, Cami, great to see you here. We'll come to you just as soon as Dr. Fulton finishes his comments.
Well, thank you, Kabir. It's great to be with you guys virtually. It's great to hear the insights of some really impressive colleagues. I like the way that Ambassador Suri framed China's presence here in the Gulf. I thought it was a really good overview of how China's approached the region. Because it has largely been an economics-driven process for most of its time here, but it's increasingly strategic, and we see that through the Belt and Road. And like Carice was talking about with its ports, and I guess Ambassador Suri mentioned as well, the port in Djibouti, the Belt and Road and all of its constituent parts is the framework of all of China's foreign policy, reaching across Eurasia, across the Indian Ocean region, into the Mediterranean. And that means that the Arabian Peninsula is a pretty important piece of real estate for Beijing. So we've seen it playing a bigger and bigger role over the past few years. Now, I remember back in 2013, which really wasn't that long ago, this giant and American China watching, David Shambaugh, wrote this book about China as a global power. And he was very skeptical, saying, yeah, it's a trading superpower, but when you look at it politically, militarily, public diplomacy, technologically, it's really kind of a second tier, if that, in most of those areas. And just a couple of short years later, after the BRI had really started to consolidate, I think he would probably have to revise that statement. It's interesting watching China's influence and power increasing from my vantage point here in Abu Dhabi, because talking to people here, it's gone from being almost an afterthought to at the forefront of almost everything. It comes up in every conversation, even if we're not talking explicitly about China. If we're talking about tech or cyber or trade or investment or whatever, China's always at the forefront. And it's interesting because it's often seen as this giant that's challenging American preponderance. And I think this is, misguided in a lot of ways. For one thing, China has a very, very shallow military footprint here. It sells a few weapons, it does some minor things, but it really doesn't present any kind of challenge. And I think what's important to remember is if you look at the hierarchy of China's interests, again, we see this strategic competition narrative that's dominating the way America frames international politics. And in this, you've got China and Russia challenging America around the world. What I think is important when we're talking about China is just to recognize that China's interests, there is a hierarchy. And at the top level, it's completely focused on its own domestic pressures, right? China's got problems with zero COVID. It's got problems with economic growth. It's got this question of will it get old before it gets rich. It's got environmental issues. It's got this disparity between the urban centers and the countryside, or the West and the coastal region. And then you've got Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and whether or not you consider Taiwan a domestic issue. This dominates Chinese leaders' concerns. They're not thinking about beating America around the world. They're thinking about taking care of that stuff because that threatens the CCP. So that dominates their thinking. And then when you get beyond that, then you're looking at, it's got 20 countries that it either shares a land border or maritime boundary with. And some of those countries, like India, have had some very serious problems with China over the years. And you've got countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, North Korea, which you've got fragile states or disruptive states. You've got Japan, South Korea. Of course, China's larger strategic concerns are in its own area. So I think it's a mistake to exaggerate the importance of the Middle East and what China's trying to achieve. Really, I'd say it's probably like a like a third tier level of what China wants to do. Now, where that's interesting is because, again, with this strategic competition narrative, because China's interests in the Middle East are primarily economic, what we've seen up until the Trump administration was China was very happy to kind of ride along under the U.S. umbrella, to not challenge anything in the region, to not push back against American leadership, even though I wouldn't say describe it as a bandwagoner. It wasn't following America's lead. It just wasn't pushing back against American leadership. On some issues like Iran, you could see where their interests diverged. China pursued a different policy, but it didn't do this trying to disrupt or challenge America's position in the region. I think that started to change when the Trump administration rolled out the trade war, when China started to think, hey, this region isn't that important, but the energy we get, the business we do, the trade we do, the construction contracts we get are important to us. And if America's going to potentially limit our ability to achieve that, then we're going to have to start pushing back. So I'd always said, really up until about 2018, you could see China kind of as a strategic hedger in the region, which, as a political scientist, I define that as they're coming into a region of importance as a second-tier power. They're following the leadership of the top one, not challenging it, trying to make good relations with everybody without alienating anybody. I think the Trump administration changed that logic, and what we've seen in the past couple of years, especially here in the UAE and in Saudi, is China hasn't been hedging. It's been wedging, how I describe it. They've been looking at these U.S. allies and partners where there is a deep concern about the U.S. commitment to the region. Is America really going to remain committed to protecting the Gulf countries? A lot of people don't think that's necessarily the case here in the Gulf. And China doesn't have to replace America. All it really has to do is convince those local actors that maybe they shouldn't think of the U.S. in the positive terms that they used to, right? So when you see this story about the Chinese installation in Khalifa Port, now, I don't know what it was. The U.S. called it a military installation. The UAE said it wasn't. I imagine it's somewhere in between. Maybe it was an intelligence facility. I think an outright military base would be a disaster for the UAE. It would be a disaster for China. But certainly there's something happening there. And then, there's a report that the Chinese are helping Saudi Arabia develop its indigenous ballistic missile systems. I think what China's been doing is saying, look, you don't have to just think of it in this, this U.S. leadership. We saw Foreign Minister Wang Yi make a statement to that effect back in January when all these Middle Eastern foreign ministers traveled to Uxi. And he said, look, the Middle East should be run by Middle Easterners. You don't need a foreign patriarch. The problems you have in the region have largely been, exacerbated by external powers. That's music to their ears. They want to hear great powers talk like this. One last point about this, which I think is interesting, is I think in the region, you'll see any number of local actors saying, we're not interested in being a theater of strategic competition. In the UAE, we hear this all the time. And it's kind of like hearing an atheist say, I don't believe in God, and somebody else saying, well, it doesn't matter because God believes in you. You're kind of stuck with great power competition, whether you like it or not. But you can see, like in the UAE, for example, they're kind of rejecting the premise. They're saying, look, we don't have a binary. Gulf countries have always been very, very good at managing extra-regional powers. And it's what we've seen in the past few months. When the F-35 deal was being, seeming to fall apart, President Macron came to the UAE and signed this massive deal to sell these Rafale jets to the UAE. The day that the Houthi drone attack hit Abu Dhabi, South Korean President Moon Jae-in was in town, and they signed a $3.5 billion to sell these surface-to-air missile system. And of course, as you, Kabir, and Ambassador Suri know all too well, India has just signed the CEPA, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with the UAE. So you can see what's happening. It's not a binary. It's not like you have to choose the U.S. or China. Yeah, the U.S. is the biggest strategic or security partner. China is the biggest economic partner. But I published a piece last week in the Atlantic Council. This logic saying China's the number one economic partner misses the fact that there are other economic partners, and collectively they add up. So China, I think, and the UAE did $75 billion worth of trade last year. Well, India and the UAE did about $61 billion. Japan was, I think, 45 or so. And you can see a lot of these countries in Asia that have problems with China, which are aligning closer and closer together. They have agency here too. And as you guys know, I mean, here in the Emirates, where something like 40% of the population comes from India, where there's deep familial and cultural and soft power connections that go back generations, China still is a very foreign country here. The ties are somewhat shallow. So it does play an important role, but it's not a matter of either or. You can see a lot of other countries establishing their own roles here, and countries like Saudi and the UAE are very happy to exploit that for their own purposes. So anyhow, I'll stop here, but really, thanks again for the invitation. Look forward to everybody else's comments.
Thanks, Dr. Fulton. There's excellent points raised there, and some of them we'll come back to after we hear Camille with her introduction and introductory statements. Camille? So, I think you're on mute.
Now?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry for this. Thanks, Kabir. Thanks for having us, and it's nice to see some familiar faces as well. So I've been asked to give a few comments on the energy relationship between China and Middle Eastern countries, because although all the colleagues here have been talking about how the ties have been diversifying in a long range of different sectors, infrastructures, technologies, etc. But at the end of the day, the core of the relationship remains energy. It remains centered on that. It is what has brought China mostly to the region at the beginning, and it remains still very much at the center of the relations still today. And there are growing questioning today on what this energy relationship is going to look like in the future, as we see growing discussions about energy transitions and how this is going to change the equilibriums between the different regions. So to start, it's at the core of the relationship. If you look at the China's Arab policy paper in 2016, that is a bit the framework of China's relations with Arab countries. The 1+2+3 cooperation framework really puts energy at the core of the relationship. And if we, just to give a few numbers to put the basis of that, but if we look at from China's side, the energy imports have been booming in the past 2 decades, and about half of that almost is coming from the Middle East. It's been reducing a little bit in the proportion of Middle Eastern countries in China's imports have been reducing slightly in recent years, mainly because of China's efforts to try to diversify its energy sources. But overall, it remains quite a strong dependence. And from the Gulf perspective as well, the dependence is quite strong. China has become their biggest energy client with Japan. We see that Japan's demand is kind of declining. It's on a declining trend, but the share of China in the Gulf energy exports has been, on the contrary, jumping very rapidly. It was about 5% of Gulf energy exports in the early 2000s, and it has been jumping to about 16% today. There's been a strong emphasis of Gulf states to try to secure long-term access to the Chinese market, because it is part of their prosperity. And so we've seen a developing relation on the energy side between the two sides that is going beyond the simple transactional buyer-seller relationship, but trying to craft a long-term strategic energy partnership with investments on both sides along the value chain, investment in upstream and downstream industries, getting stakes in oil fields and exploration projects, in energy infrastructures, in storage, transport, refineries, etc. So we're seeing a more integrated investment in more integrated value chain on both sides. And it's important to monitor the evolution of this energy relationship, because the question has been, what does it mean exactly in terms of China's political and potential security engagement with the region? Because it is at the beginning this growing interest in securing access to energy that has driven the need for China to deepen also the political ties and, to some extent, the security ties with the region. And the question is always, to what extent this is going to continue in the future if China remains highly dependent on Middle Eastern energy. But today the question is around how this is going to evolve in the coming decades with the ongoing energy transitions. It depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the pace of adoption of renewable energies by different countries, the technological evolutions. It depends also on the evolution in the price of renewable energies or the adoption of carbon capture technologies. On the demand side, it would depend as well, for example, on the pace of the economic growth in China in the coming decades, and demographic trends as well in China or in other big energy importers like India, for example. But if we look at the different scenarios and forecasts that have been made by the US Energy Information Administration, for example, or the International Energy Agency, or BP, we can see, so they have different pictures for the future, depending on what assumptions or what hypotheses they're basing themselves on. But what some of the main patterns that we can see is that, first of all, they project China to remain the largest crude oil importer for at least the coming 8 to 10 years. For example, Aramco CEO Amin Nasser declared recently that China's energy security would remain Saudi Arabia's priority for the coming 50 years. But if we look at the longer term trends, for example, China's oil demand is projected to plateau at some point around 2030, 2040, depends which scenario you're looking at, and slightly starts declining in 2050. And it will be, for example, catched up by the demand from India during that period. Sorry. there is also an interesting trend, which is that it's actually projected that during that period of transition in the coming decades, there will be a growing interdependency between Middle Eastern producers and China or Asian importers, because the fact that Middle East OPEC countries are set to drive the increase of oil production in the coming decades until 2050, and this is partly because some other producers, non-Middle Eastern and non-OPEC producers, will see some of their oil fields coming to maturity or becoming more costly to exploit. And so the Gulf countries especially are going to remain some of the cheapest energy and hydrocarbon producers, and will probably remain some of the last ones to stay on the production side. And on the demand side, there will be a growing demand from Asian countries that won't be matched by domestic production. So it will lead to a greater, at least for this period of transition, a greater interdependency between China and Middle Eastern energy producers. There will be also, and on that front, Gulf countries are going to play still a very important role for China in terms of adjusting and stabilizing oil prices. Because in period of adjustments of demand and offer on the energy markets, there will be probably greater disruptions of energy prices, and on that sense, Gulf countries will still be very important for China in terms of making sure that the market remains balanced. On the LNG market as well, there are discussions about to what extent LNG is going to play a greater role as a bridge energy during that time of transition. And this would put, for example, gas producers like Qatar with a greater role for the energy security of countries like China. And China's gas imports dependency is going to increase a lot in the future. Saying it's not energy, but it's energy, but there is also, we often don't speak that much about oil products and petrochemicals. And again, it's not considered as oil exports, but they're flagged by many Middle Eastern countries as priority sectors for their economic visions. And so Gulf countries will see a lot of opportunities to really try to up their market shares in China in the petrochemicals sector. And finally, in the renewable energy, again, big question mark exactly on what will be the future trends. We see that a number of Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and to some extent Oman, are trying to position themselves as blue or green hydrogen producers, and potentially among the cheapest ones. We are only at the initial phase of feasibility studies on that front. China hasn't really shown much interest in importing hydrogen, unlike other countries like Japan or Korea. But it will still play an important, the relationship in the renewable sector with Gulf countries is going to be important, because China is one of the most it's one of the leaders in terms of equipment and renewable technologies. It has control over most of the value chain, including rare earth materials necessary for these renewable technologies. And so on that front, China is going to be an important partner of Gulf countries when it comes to their energy transitions and their investments in the renewable sector. So to conclude on this, it's still difficult to predict exactly how these relations are going to evolve in the coming decades. But with that comes the question of to what extent to what extent China is going to remain dependent for its energy security to Gulf countries, especially at a moment when it appears that securing access to energy resources is not as maybe not as strategic that it might have been in the past. And so to what extent this transforms a little bit the relationships, that makes it more asymmetrical in favor of China, for example. And of course, it also poses a lot of questions on how this is going to affect the balance of powers between different countries. For example, the growing importance of Qatar, if LNG export is becoming more important. How also intra GCC competition is going to be shaped by this, and we've seen between Saudi Arabia and the UAE already a little bit of that competition happening around energy prices. And same with Iran, whatever happens with the JCPOA is also going to have an impact on the future of energy trade between China and Iran, and is going to have de facto an important impact also on for other Middle Eastern producers. So I stop here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cami. I'm glad someone finally mentioned Iran, which I'll touch upon a little bit later on. But most of my questions are going to be out of the comments made by the panelists, and I would like to start with posing a question both to Ambassador Suri and Carice as well. We have this very Star Warsy I2U2 thing that is being formed between the four countries whose foreign ministers met, I think, a couple of months back. And now it's supposed to be a more sort of summit level next month, although being virtual in most of its part. But how do you see, what's the blueprint here? I mean, we've seen sort of the foreign minister meeting happen, and now this is announced, but a bit of a lull in the middle about what is it supposed to be beyond meetings, if I may. So let me pose it to you to offer a small blueprint. Like, what are we going? How is this going to be developed in the future according to your views? So, Ambassador Suri, you can go first, and Carice can go second.
Okay, so crystal ball gazing time. Kabir, I think that they're going to start relatively modestly with relatively non-controversial areas like technology, economy, transport connections, some infrastructure-related conversations, but to me, it would be a natural transition to bring in security dimension as well. If two of the four members of I2C2 are the I and the U is India and the US, which are also common to the other quad, then I think certain amount of flow of ideas, structures, best practices from the Indo-Pacific to the Middle East is almost written into the script. That some of these, if you are doing some interesting and useful things in the Indo-Pacific, then there's no reason not to bring those across into this as well. So I think while the Indo-Pacific Quad will continue to have its more overt focus on China without using the C word at any point of time, well, maybe once or twice the Americans have used it, but the others haven't. This one, because of the complexity that you have two countries, Israel and UAE, who have fairly close ties with China, and you have two countries, UAE and India and US, who have a very currently difficult relationship with China. So you're going to see interesting conversations take place around that space. But I certainly see it progressing beyond the initial statements of transport, infrastructure, economy, and technology into something more robust, and where conversations around strategic interests become part of the framework.
Right. Carice?
I really appreciate the question because we've been asking as well. Meeting with some of before Biden's visit, we hosted the Taiwan coordinator from the State Department, and then the deputy assistant or assistant deputy assistant in the State Department on global China. And in both cases, we raised this because it's a fascinating opportunity for Israel. And honestly, both from the Israeli government and the U.S. government, I don't even think they're as organized as as Ambassador Suri just described. It's really up for grabs. I think it would be smart, and I do think it's the intention to follow the path that Ambassador Suri outlined as the opening salvo. It makes sense that economics and Israel would love to see more options for infrastructure bidders, for example. We were talking to the political director in the India embassy, and she was saying, we also have excellent infrastructure companies in India. And I think Israel has had trouble getting, there are no real players in the US, some European, mainly China, and the more competition, the better. But I think what's very important about and I love your Star Wars thing, because it's just in my view it's a hilarious name, but or code name. But the mindset in Israel, as soon as you say Indo-Pacific, you lose your audience. Like, what is that? Up until very recently, the only area that Israel thought about was the US and to some extent Europe. And in the last few years, we've seen more awareness of China. And that may seem absurd, but it's really only in the last few years. We're not really there with the rest of Asia, but it's on track. And Indo-Pacific is just a non-starter. So I think by bringing this grouping together, and you saw that the UAE and Israel had this incredible run, 5 months to sign a free trade agreement. That is a record. It's certainly a record for us, which shows that the under the table relations had been very advanced and developed when the Abraham Accords were signed. Otherwise, I can't see this could have happened so quickly. So UAE is actually a serious pillar of China's interests in the region. I think 60% of all of China's exports come through the UAE to the rest of the Middle East, among other things. So, and Israel, has its own unique role to play in the Middle East, which China acknowledges pretty straightforwardly. And so this gathering, I think, from the perspective of the Israelis, is a chance to be exposed to what does the Indo-Pacific mean? How is it connected to us? There are countries in the Middle East that are on the Red Sea, which, as far as I know, geographically is the Indo-Pacific. Once again, a sketch we're going to have to do, maybe in cartoon fashion for some people here. Regarding security, I think that's going to be more of a challenge. It depends on how it's approached. I think assessing the security side of things is always critical. What actions are actually done? India's largest defense buyer at this stage. Israel and the UAE will be developing new technologies together with the U.S. there. So I think there's a lot of ways that we could look at security, and as the ambassador said, without it necessarily being directly related to China in any way. I just want to conclude by saying that the more there are these groupings of countries, the better. I think it strengthens each one, regardless of China. I think it's a healthy process for countries that don't necessarily have experience in close relations and cultivating working path together. It opens up new opportunities, it creates new ways of thinking, and it strengthens each of the component parts. So however it does develop, as long as it does continue to develop, I think it will be a positive contributor to the region.
Right. I'll quickly move for keeping the time in mind to a question that I would like to pose to both Camille and Jonathan. And this is coming from an article I read by James Dorsey, which was, I think, in the Middle East Institute recently, where the author is hypothesizing that China is going to enter very choppy waters when it comes to Beijing's relations with the Middle East, and basically sort of taking into account the various sort of internal fissures within the Middle East and navigating those fissures when it's trying to be the largest investment partner with everyone, basically. And so I just want to sort of come to this question via Tehran. And how do you see an announcement such as what China made with regard to Iran, which was some ridiculous figure of $400 billion or $350 billion over an non-specified period of time? But how do you see China navigating this? Because of course, it's possible. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's also utopian at some level that you are equal partners with everyone in the region when everyone with each other is not an equal partner. So you'll have to sort of be stepping on certain toes somewhere in an attempt to to safeguard whether your economic or political interests. So how do you see China sort of navigating this? I mean, we've seen sort of India navigate it at a very smaller level, if you may. But how do you see China sort of going through this this path of trying to keep everyone happy, but also becoming their biggest sort of political and strategic and economic partner? Camille, you can start. Maybe you can come to Jonathan after that.
Sure, thank you. I think when it comes to China's perspective, I mean, for China, from China's point of view on this, I don't see actually a problem at the horizon. I mean, China has been, I mean, maybe others disagree with me, but China has been doing a great job until now at keeping good relations with everyone and at imposing that to each of its partners, and without really getting any much questioning in return. I mean, at the moment when there was these announcements about this important partnership with Iran, it raised a bit of questions and concerns in the GCC side. But at the same time, there is, I mean, I think also because partly the relationship is quite asymmetrical, and so most of these countries don't really have the ability to press China on these issues. And because they know also that the relationship is based on this notion of, you know, non-intervention in each other's affairs. Most of the countries in the region are quite happy with the fact that China is not questioning them about who they deal with exactly or what they do internally in their own countries. And so they're happy to, you know, to follow the same motto when it comes to China's relations with other countries. So I think actually for me, where I see a problem arising, it's not for China and China's ability to navigate different countries, because I think that it can actually continue for quite a long time without having to take side anywhere, because it is in a dominant position economically, and it has the ability to do so. Where I see an issue coming, it's for the Middle Eastern countries and that are increasingly, being stuck between the rock and the hard place. Is that what you say in English? Where, especially when it comes to their relationship with the US is voluntarily securitizing economic relations and some of the economic relations these countries have with China, and they're trying to resist these pressures. We've seen that on the question of 5G and all the debate in the UAE around the F-35 deal, for example. They're trying to resist it, but I'm not sure that they will be able to resist it for much longer. And depending on what exactly they're going to negotiate with the US in terms of the security arrangement they could have with the US in the future. But this is going to come also with probably some conditions when it comes to their relations with China. So I see the issue more coming for the position of Middle Eastern countries than China's position, which I think is quite good for now.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, so a couple of things about this. I understand why this China-Iran relationship draws a lot of attention. It's a very sexy story. These two authoritarian countries that are threatening to undermine, the region's stability and, of course, challenging U.S. preponderance and U.S. leadership. But, I mean, really, the fact is China's, like I said earlier, its goal in the region is largely economic. And to that end, its preference, of course, is always regional stability. And Iran is a very disruptive actor. It threatens regional stability, kind of as a matter of course. So I think the importance of Iran to Beijing is always quite exaggerated. You can see this comprehensive strategic partnership. It got a lot of news in the summer of 20, and then it was signed in 21. But it went back to the end of the JCPOA. The first head of state to visit Iran at the end of after the JCPOA was signed was Xi Jinping, and he promised Iran that they're going to increase trade to something like $600 billion within 10 years, and they're going to do all this investment. And that's because China had leaned on Iran quite a bit during the JCPOA to get them to sign the thing. Saying, look, this is if you become a normal country, these are the benefits you get: trade, investment, infrastructure. You'll get economic benefits of this. So Xi Jinping went to Saudi and signed this comprehensive strategic partnership in January 16. Then he went to Egypt and met with the Arab League, and then he went to Tehran and signed the same deal that he just signed with the Saudis, which drove everybody crazy. Everybody wants China to get off the fence and behave like a normal great power would behave. Balance one side or the other. And Beijing's consistently indicated they have no interest in doing that. The issue, though, of course, was the JCPOA was undermined just a few months later when Donald Trump was elected president, because all during the campaign, he said, the JCPOA was the worst deal ever signed, and we're going to get tough on China. And what you saw was this partnership that China announced with Iran in January 16 immediately they cooled. They didn't do anything with it. And they were content to, follow American sanctions throughout the Trump presidency, because China's economic relations with the U.S. are vastly larger than those with Tehran, and always will be. And the same thing with the UAE, and the same thing with Saudi. It does very little trade, it does very little investment, it does very little at all with Iran. Iranians don't trust China, Chinese don't trust Iran. I mean, it's very much a fair weather and like Camille said, a very asymmetrical relationship. I think China uses Tehran to, keep America stuck in the Gulf so that the pivot never happens. They're never going to, if the Fifth Fleet is stationed at Bahrain, then China doesn't have to worry about America come into the South China Sea or the East Sea in any greater role. But what you have seen again is China has been doing more with Iran. They did sign this partnership finally in 21. And then a few months later, they said that they didn't mind if Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But both of those things are, for either one of those things to become useful to Iran or to China, Iran has to stop being under sanctions. Chinese companies aren't going to invest in Iran if it's under sanctions, just like India is not going to go into Chabahar in any great way if they're worried about, getting caught up in it. So I think when China is reaching out to Iran in this way, what they're doing is they're trying to force Iran towards a more, stable presence, to say, look, again, go back to Vienna, sign the deal, and then you get Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you get the partnership. But if not, you'll see a continuation of what we've seen over the past 6 years, which is very, very, very deep operationalization of this partnership with the Saudis, and since 2018 with the Emiratis. MBS is the co-chair of the Saudi partnership, and Khaldun Mubarak is from the Emirati side. They're very senior members working together with the Chinese counterparts to develop this thing. You don't see that in Iran yet, because I think there's not a lot of appetite for engaging seriously with Iran until it stops being a disruptive actor in the region. But again,
right.
it can shape that,
All right. So I would just like to thank everyone for joining in today. I think this was a fantastic discussion, the first of its kind we've had at ORF on this topic, at least. And we're looking forward to, of course, continuing this in the future. So thanks everyone for taking the time out today, and have a good day ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kabir.